I wasn't always the person who walked into rooms and commanded attention. There was a time when I blended into the back row, my name mispronounced in meetings, my ideas praised, just never to my face. Hi, I'm Riley Vaughn, and this isn't a revenge story. It's a story about building something no one believed in until they had to rely on it. 6 years ago, I was a junior developer at one of the fastest growing tech firms in the country. I had a system. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't polished, but it worked. They laughed. They rewrote it, they broke it, and then they pretended I'd never built it in the first place. But I didn't shout. I didn't sue. I walked away with nothing but a blueprint and the one thing they couldn't strip from me: vision. Today, their login screens run on the very architecture they once called too academic. And the best part? They don't even know they're paying for it. Yet, this is a story for anyone who's ever been overlooked. For the quiet minds in loud rooms. For the builders behind closed doors. If you've ever been told you were too young, too green, or just not the right fit, pull up a chair. You're not alone, and this story is just getting started. At Viant Tech, the 19th floor was all glass and gold logos. But the floor that actually built things, that was the basement. No windows, just a sea of overworked developers, half-empty coffee cups, and monitors glowing into the night. That's where I lived figuratively, and sometimes literally. I was 23, fresh out of grad school, and the newest back-end engineer in a room full of veterans. My badge still creaked when I clipped it on. They didn't dislike me, not exactly. I just blended in, like a chair or a spare monitor. People stepped around me, passed me Post-its, but rarely looked me in the eye. My name was the girl with the server fix, or the one who's good with the load balancer. Never just Riley, never someone worth remembering. One Friday, we hit a bottleneck on a data stream project. Everyone threw up their hands. I spent the weekend building a load clustering model that rerouted traffic dynamically. When we ran it Monday morning, the server speeds tripled. They cheered, high-fived. Someone said, "Great work, team." I smiled quietly. No one looked my way. That's when I realized being good wasn't enough if no one believed you had value. I wasn't angry, just aware. There's a difference between being invisible and being underestimated. I wasn't the ghost in the lab. I was the architect they couldn't see yet. And sometimes being unseen is the perfect vantage point to observe everything that needs to change. Next came the moment that tested everything I thought I knew. Because when I finally spoke up, they didn't just ignore me. They laughed. And that laugh changed the course of my life. It started with a spreadsheet. Well, technically, a simulation model inside a spreadsheet. I had been working nights testing how our server clusters handled traffic spikes. The data was clear, the current structure was bleeding efficiency. I built a prototype compact self-healing and designed to optimize memory flow. My lead Jonah told me to keep it to myself. Let the senior architects handle system changes, he said. But the numbers were too strong to ignore. So I signed up for the internal innovation session open to all departments. I walked in with a USB drive and a pounding heart. The room had 30 people. Most had been at Viant Tech since I was in middle school. I introduced myself, showed the numbers, walked through the system logic. Silence. Then Martin Shaw, our VP of Systems, leaned back in his chair and chuckled. "This is interesting," he said, "but this kind of system assumes perfect conditions. That's not how the real world works." Laughter followed. Someone made a joke about final projects from undergrad. Jonah looked away. I didn't respond. I just gathered my notes, unplugged my drive, and walked out. Later that night, I cried only a little in the parking garage where no one could see. It wasn't the rejection. It was the way they dismissed the idea like it never had a chance. Like I never had a chance. But here's the thing, no one told me sometimes laughter is just fear in disguise. And people laugh at what they don't understand, especially when it comes from someone they didn't expect. What they didn't know was that I hadn't built that system for approval. I built it because the problem was real, and I wasn't done. The next part, that's when things stopped being theoretical. Because 2 weeks later, I found my code with someone else's name on it. It was a Thursday night when I got the ping. Just a generic email from our internal testing sandbox. Nothing urgent, but something felt off. I clicked in. My access hadn't been revoked, probably a mistake, or maybe they hadn't noticed I was still in the system. Inside a folder labeled Server Flow R3, I found it. My code, or most of it. The structure, the routing tree, even the error handling logic, it was mine. Except now, it was labeled as a project led by a senior dev named Brandon. His name was on every page, but it wasn't just that they took it. They broke it. The new version was stripped of key components. They'd removed the adaptive throttling safeguards, flattened the priority queues, and hard-coded variables that were meant to scale. I ran a test out of morbid curiosity. It crashed violently at just 30% of expected load. I sat there staring at the screen numb. Not just because they stole it, but because they didn't even understand what they'd stolen. I could have reported it. I could have gone to HR. I could have made a scene. But instead, I did something quieter and far more dangerous. I copied my original files onto a flash drive, zipped the folder, and slid it into my coat pocket. That was the night I stopped working for them and started building something of my own. Because here's what I learned: ideas are fragile but not powerless. When protected and nurtured outside the wrong hands, they can become unstoppable. The system they butchered would soon collapse. But mine was just getting started. I printed the letter at 7:43 a.m. on a Monday. Just 12 lines, one paragraph about pursuing personal goals, another offering 2 weeks for a smooth transition. Formal, measured, the kind of letter no one really reads, just files away. I folded it once, then again, and again, 4 times. I don't know why. Maybe because I needed it to feel real in my hand. Something solid I could hold on to when everything else felt so flimsy. No one stopped me as I walked into the office that day. I slipped the letter into Jonah's inbox before he arrived. Then I logged into my machine and spent the next hour clearing old commits and transferring my notes to a private server. Not out of bitterness, out of protection, because by then I knew what they were willing to do to an idea they didn't understand. The goodbyes were brief. Some didn't notice I was leaving. Others gave a polite nod, the kind you offer a neighbor moving 2 streets over, not someone whose fingerprints had quietly shaped the system under their fingers. I walked out with my coat, a half-used notebook, and that folded letter tucked into my pocket like a promise. Here's the thing: no one tells you quitting isn't always giving up. Sometimes it's planting a flag in your own direction. I didn't have a plan yet. No funding, no team, just a dusty laptop, a blueprint with potential, and a fire I hadn't felt in years. The next few months would test everything: my resolve, my health, even my bank account. But what I found in those quiet, broke, caffeine-fueled nights, it became the foundation for something much bigger. I moved into a 360-square-foot studio off East Lamar, the kind of place where the fridge hummed louder than the traffic outside. Rent was $620 a month. That left me with $200 in total savings, a folding table for a desk and a mattress on the floor. My parents thought I was taking a sabbatical. I didn't correct them. How do you explain you're starting a company when your most valuable asset is an old ThinkPad and an unproven algorithm? The first 3 months were brutal. No clients, no pitch deck, just me, a blank terminal, and takeout soy sauce packets pretending to be dinner. I coded in sweatpants. I skipped birthdays. I woke up to error logs and fell asleep to database rebuilds. One night, the power went out mid-deploy. I cried. Then I rewrote the code by flashlight. I learned to stretch every dollar free cloud credits, beta licenses, cold emails at 2 a.m. I studied UI design from YouTube tutorials. I failed 5 times trying to integrate dynamic load throttling. On the 6th try, it worked. Synapse wasn't a product yet, but it was real. Fast, reliable, self-correcting, like a nervous system for broken infrastructures. And slowly, I began to believe that maybe I wasn't crazy. Here's the truth. I wish someone had told me back then: when you start from nothing, everything you build feels like a miracle. And that gratitude, it fuels you more than funding ever could. But belief alone doesn't pay rent. I needed backing. Not just a check, but someone who truly saw the system for what it could become. And then one investor walked in, and she didn't nod politely. She leaned in. Her name was Thenna Brooks. I almost didn't take the meeting. It was a Friday afternoon. I was exhausted, and the last 3 investor calls had ended with vague smiles and "keep us posted." They all liked the idea, but no one seemed to believe I could pull it off. But Thenna, she showed up early, no entourage, no blazer, just a simple black turtleneck, a notebook, and a sharpness in her eyes that told me she wasn't here to be impressed. I started my pitch like usual: the problem with legacy infrastructure, the bloated middleware, the rising cost of downtime. But Thenna didn't nod along like others. She interrupted. How does Synapse handle concurrent version control with asynchronous processes? I blinked. No one had asked that, not even the CTOs. We spent 2 hours in that cafe. Her coffee went cold. My voice cracked. But for the first time, someone didn't just see my numbers, they saw my thinking. She flipped her notebook closed and said, "Riley, this doesn't need a bridge round. It needs a runway." 10 days later, she wired the funds. $5 million for 20% equity, full technical freedom, and one condition: Don't water it down. Build the version they said was impossible. That moment changed everything. We registered the company as Brookwell Systems, my middle name and my grandmother's last. Synapse was reborn with a name, a logo, a real team. And just in time, because while we were building, something else was breaking. Across the city, the system they stole from me was starting to fail. It happened on a Tuesday, 9:17 a.m. Central Time. I was on a video call with a logistics startup when my Slack notifications started lighting up, first from our monitoring tool, then from our shared channel with a healthcare client. At first, I thought it was a false alarm, but then someone forwarded me a news article, Viant Tech experiencing system-wide outage affecting over 1.2 million users. My stomach didn't twist. My hands didn't shake. I just sat still and stared out the window. I knew exactly what had happened. The system they built based on a stripped version of mine had hit its natural limit. The dependencies were too tight. The fallback protocols had been gutted. One overloaded input brought the whole framework down. Patients couldn't log into medical portals. Warehouses lost their inventory tracking. By noon, 4 of their clients had already jumped ship. One of them signed with us by Friday. We didn't gloat. We didn't post anything. Synapse just kept humming in the background, rerouting, balancing, adapting, quietly doing the work it was designed to do. I learned something that day: the best revenge isn't revenge, it's relevance. When the world stops ignoring your work and starts depending on it, there's no need to shout. Your results speak in uptime and reliability. That Tuesday, Synapse proved itself. But I knew what was coming next, because systems fail, and people scramble. And the company that once laughed at me, they were about to come knocking. The email came in like any other subject line: strategic infrastructure inquiry. The sender, Martin Shaw, the same VP who once laughed me out of a room, now opened with, "We've been closely following Brookwell Systems and would value a potential collaboration." I read it twice, maybe 3 times. Not a flicker of recognition, not a mention of Vaughn, just polite interest in Ms. Brookwell, the mystery founder with the solution they desperately needed. I responded the next morning, courteous, professional, inviting them to my downtown office for a meeting on my terms. They arrived on a Thursday, Martin in his signature suit flanked by Brandon and 2 others I recognized, but hadn't missed. None of them batted an eye when they saw me. The name on the wall said Brookwell Systems, and the woman in the navy blazer behind the glass desk wasn't the fresh-faced junior dev they once dismissed. "Ms. Brookwell," Martin said, extending his hand, "we appreciate your time." I shook it calmly. "Of course, please have a seat." There's something surreal about watching people negotiate with the person they once ignored. They sat across from me, pitching pain points, buzzwords, begging in coded language. The irony was so thick, I almost smiled. Here's the lesson: when you detach from needing recognition, you gain power. I didn't need them to remember me. I needed them to need me. And now they did. But the best part? They still hadn't figured it out. At least not yet. They began with compliments, carefully scripted ones. "Your platform's adaptability is impressive. Brookwell Systems clearly understands modern scalability." I nodded, said little. Martin spoke like a man used to getting ahead by sounding like he knows what he's doing. But I'd heard it before. Behind his smooth language, I could hear the panic. He listed their needs: real-time data sync, infrastructure modernization, disaster recovery. Then he asked finally, "What would it take for your team to license Synapse to us?" I paused, reached beneath my desk and tapped the small button that activated the wall screen behind me. A single PDF file appeared. Title: Synapse Flow Architecture. Internal white paper, author Vaughn. The room froze. Brandon's mouth opened, then closed again. Martin's brow furrowed in disbelief, as if squinting might rewrite what was on the screen. I leaned forward, calm. "You don't remember me, do you?" I said. "The girl who pitched you a dynamic cluster model you called a school project?" Martin's face drained. That was me," I finished. "It's always been me. Just under a name you never bothered to learn." Silence, thick embarrassed silence. The offer they'd come to make it evaporated. Replaced by uncertainty, desperation. That was the moment the mask fell. When power shifted across the table, not with rage, but with clarity. I didn't want to hurt them. I just wanted them to see me. But by the time they did, it was too late. Because I wasn't selling Synapse back to them, I was buying them out. I slid the folder across the table. Inside, acquisition documents, shareholder approvals, digital signatures. For a long time, Martin just stared, his hand, resting on the first page, but not turning it. His fingers trembled slightly. "This is a takeover," he said, his voice low. "You're buying us." "Yes," I replied softly. "Brookwell Systems has secured majority interest in your voting shares." The offer is public by end of quarter. It wasn't revenge. It was a course correction. Viant Tech had been sinking for years, bloated infrastructure, outdated leadership innovation, driven more by ego than insight. What we were offering wasn't punishment. It was rescue. He looked up, anger flickering behind tired eyes. Why, he whispered, after everything, why? I gave him the most honest answer I had. Because your failure was never personal, but your blindness that nearly cost the industry years of progress. Some people stayed, some left. Brandon took a role in compliance structure was his strength, not strategy. The rest of the old guard stepped aside. The office where I once got laughed out of, it's now my backup workspace. I don't use it often, but sometimes on quiet nights, I sit there with a cup of tea and reread my first resignation letter, creased at the folds, edges soft. On the back in my own shaky handwriting, I'd written, "Remember this moment. It's not the end." And it wasn't. It was the beginning. If you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or underestimated yourself, know this. You don't need to prove them wrong. You just need to prove you right. And when the time comes, don't ask for your seat at the table. Build the table, then decide who gets to sit with you.